For in-depth analysis of renewable energy policy and renewable energy finance, we have expert Toby Couture with us today. Toby Couture is the founder and director of renewable energy at E3 Analytics of Berlin, Germany. If you'd like to find out Monsieur Couture's educational background, credential, and the list of his publication, please refer to May 16, 2014 issue or the post at sunisthefuture.net. Without further ado, we give you Toby Couture.
I have seen more about, I first read about what you've written back in, I think, 2011. But that was having to do with your summary report from NREL about, it was the policy maker's guide to the feed-in tariff policy design.
Yep.
And so it's really tell us why it was a wonderful guidebook. And but tell us, why is it that you were chosen to do this, or was it something that you voluntarily decided to take part in the project?
I was actually on a scholarship in the United States, and I worked, rather than going to a university to do it, I actually applied to do it at NREL. So I was there technically for about a year on site in Colorado on a Fulbright. And in that process, because I had already written a number of papers on feed-in tariffs, they had an ongoing research project that had just started in 2008. Summer 2008 on FITS, and when I arrived, they basically gave me the portfolio, and they said, "Here's our research, here's the paper," and at the time, it was just scattered footnotes and references, outdated references to Germany, and so it took quite a bit of time to pull that together. And I was on site, as I said, for about a year, and when I moved back to Canada, I continued to work on a project on subcontract for the lab. So it enabled me to finish it, and along with a number of other papers that we co-authored, and sort of set the stage for a lot of the feed-in tariff work in the U.S. and has been used, I guess, around the world. I hear from policymakers every now and then who reach out, who actively use it. So that's good to see and good to know. So it has. It was quite a big research undertaking, and we went through several drafts. But that's basically the quick version to how it emerged.
Well, it has been very helpful to many countries, and even at Sunis Future, we have frequently referred to that particular policy guideline. But a lot of our readers or viewers may not be quite as familiar with it. So I think this is a good opportunity, and we're really glad to be able to get hold of you to shed some light on this seemingly very important policy, because everything I've read so far seems to indicate this is the perfect policy, or the most effective policy to be able to help to spread renewable energy. So tell us a little bit more. Can you shed some light on what's the pluses and minuses, and why is it so effective?
Well, at the end of the day, to finance a wind project or to finance a solar project, they're very capital intensive. So you need to have some kind of a long-term contract for that. Now, what feed-in tariffs distinguish from other mechanisms is the way in which those long-term contracts are awarded or are attributed, allocated, one might say, to different participants in the market. So, for example, you can achieve long-term contracts through a traditional tendering process for bidding for large projects. That tends to favor larger players, more well-capitalized players who can produce a competitive bid. Another mechanism is simply to use bilateral contracts. So, for example, in Africa, this is quite common, where utilities will sign bilateral contracts behind closed doors with a particular company or a particular project proponent. Now, that can get the job done. In other words, you can get a long-term contract in either of those two ways. But where feed-in tariffs differ is that they make that long-term contract available to anybody. And that's really been a key to their success is that citizens, individuals, community groups, investors, small businesses, utilities themselves can invest in projects and get a long-term contract on a standard term. So the more, as I reflect back on all of the feed-in tariff research and work and a lot of the work I've done with governments around the world, that's kind of the basic, at the most basic level, the distinction. Both, all of them result in some kind of a long-term contract, or what's called a long-term offtake agreement for the power that's produced. But where feed-in tariffs differ is that they make that contract available to anybody, provided that you meet certain minimum requirements. Now, once you're connected, another fundamental difference is that because it's owned by a wider number of people, a wider number of individuals can benefit from renewable energy development. And that, some have argued, is necessary to maintain support in the long run for the renewable energy transition. If we were to simply substitute coal plants for wind farms and leave the traditional utility structure intact, we may have a lower carbon energy mix, but we may not have really gotten the full value of the renewable energy transformation. And I think what's happening here in Germany and what is significant about what the feed-in tariff has enabled is that it's enabled a wider range of participation in the marketplace, and it has decentralized fundamentally the electricity supply industry, which for about a century now has been quite highly centralized. And I think that's fundamentally been enabled by that kind of open market, open participatory characteristic of the FIT.
You mentioned the cost. Of course, that's probably the most important decision in any project, or whether or not something is going to be taking place. And as a matter of fact, about 2 days ago in our local area, there was a spring party. People were having a picnic party in a park. And one of the people, actually there's more than one, that's having this kind of questions on mind is a lot of the general public have the costs basically from many years ago in mind. And solar, as far as I'm aware of, has gone down quite a bit in the last 2 years. So, but is it cost effective for people to install solar at this point, do you think? That's one of the main arguments.
If you look, there's nowhere in Europe currently where you can develop solar for more than the retail price. So the retail price across Europe is anywhere from 16 euro cents in Spain, somewhere around 14 euro cents in France, upwards of 27 or 28 euro cents here in Germany and Denmark. Nordic countries, it's a little lower, particularly for industrial customers, but still for retail, it's around 12 to 15. And there's almost nowhere in Europe where you can't build solar for that price. So on a levelized basis, PV is now, we are well beyond grid parity in Europe, and we are well beyond grid parity, or what some people call socket parity, in much of the United States. Now, that's only part of the challenge. Getting to socket parity is one thing, but the other component to that is that you actually need to have the enabling environment that enables people to actually make that switch. And in many jurisdictions, that enabling environment isn't there, or it's actively sort of resisted. We've seen a battle, as you know, in states like Arizona in the U.S. against distributed PV, taxation on PV systems to recover grid costs. There's an active, growing, I think, hostility or resistance to solar development, partly because I think it does really strike at the core of the traditional centralized utility model. So we're on the cusp of really quite potentially quite transformative shifts in the electricity industry, driven by the fact that solar is now so cost competitive. We're working on a project now with the International Energy Agency on what are called prosumers. And this is the idea of producers and consumers. In other words, in the future, in the beginning of the internet, there were people who doubted that average citizens would ever want to, create their own website or contribute to things like Wikipedia. People just, who has time for that? We all have 9-to-5 jobs, and who has time to write an entry on Wikipedia? Now, that obviously underestimated the desire of people to participate, to contribute, to both produce and consume web content. And now, again, we've seen that in the media industry with the massive decentralization away from traditional news outlets. And this, I think, your son, of which this is in some sense arguably a
yes.
small part of. And I think we're on the cusp of something similar in the electricity industry, where the prosumer revolution could start to fundamentally overturn the way that we've thought about the way that people traditionally consume energy and electricity from a network. We may, in 10 or 15 years, be in a place where most individual residential households have their own PV system and are all prosumers, or virtually all prosumers. In other words, giving and taking, constantly levelizing their monthly or daily input and output, and billing it on some sort of an integrated way with other actors in the network. There's discussion of sharing, peer-to-peer energy sharing, where you could actually, with your neighbor, or your co-op, or your neighborhood, develop micro exchanges, to sort of share kilowatt hours during the daytime when you're not using them. And all of those things are made possible partly by the technological changes, but also by the rapid cost declines in solar. And I don't think we've quite realized or grasped as an energy community, as researchers, as analysts, quite how fundamental that transformation is of solar having come down so far in cost. I think it's, again, we're just at the beginning.
Wow, it's within the last 1 and 2 years, it's just amazing to watch it go down. And I can imagine what it'll be like in the next few years. And I really like that perfect example of Wikipedia you just had for prosumer. Certainly, we have been using a lot of Wikipedia, and it's been great. And but speaking of which, I was actually thinking about I just got back from Australia, as a matter of fact, and I was watching what's been going on in Australia. And during the year of 2009 and 2011, their PV installation, capacity seems to have went up by tenfold or so, but mainly, I think it has a great deal to do with feed-in tariff and what they call it the MRET, the mandatory renewable energy target. But my question is, how is that going to impact us here in the U.S.? Are we going to be able to catch up with countries such as Australia, where in terms of how competitive we will be able to maintain, or simply because we're not currently utilizing feed-in tariff fully? How is it going to impact us?
There's an important difference in Australia. Australia's, it's a good point and a good example, I think, for the U.S. because it's a large landmass. It has comparable solar resources on an average basis, maybe even a little bit better. And however, the market in Australia, they call it a feed-in tariff, but essentially it was net metering with a payment attached. So all systems are actually behind the meter for the vast majority of them. There are a few larger PV projects, but the vast majority of residential projects are behind the meter. So they're actually net metered, they're configured as a net metering arrangement, and they receive a payment for their exported power. So slightly different than most feed-in tariffs in the United States currently, and it's probably closer from a design or policy perspective to some U.S. state-level net metering policies. But that said, I think you're absolutely right. Australia is currently at around 12% of households with solar on the roof. So now, naturally, you have a smaller population than the United States, about a tenth or less, but it's still a very significant level of penetration. But Australia is also quite similar to the US in that it is largely driven by AC peaks, so air conditioning loads, which makes it very attractive for solar on the grid and on the individual household. And Australia, much like the US, tends to have quite individualized housing market. In other words, very few multi-unit residential, largely suburban kind of spread. And I think those characteristics actually make the U.S. Position the U.S. comparatively well to follow in Australia's footsteps with the right policy and regulatory conditions in place. I think I've been thinking a lot more about what it actually takes to maintain that development or that investment. And a lot of the changes, as we mentioned in the U.S., are starting to slow down or even resist solar on the grid and solar on the network. We've had seen this big value of solar debate.
Yes, that's
and
reason.
I think those are battles that are going to have to be fought, and probably in the United States fought quite hard, and in the courts to make any meaningful progress. But I think that, like with many other things in the U.S. context, it's driven fundamentally by leadership at the local and state level. I don't foresee tremendous momentum for anything federal, as it was in some other countries like Germany. I think we're looking more likely at truly bottom-up development there, where you have leadership at the local and state level that really push things forward.
You just answered one of my other questions on grassroots, whether or not it's really critical for Feedin tariff to become available to most of the areas within U.S. Do you think it's a parliamentary system versus a non-parliamentary system that kind of contribute to this our slowness in U.S. in adopting Feedin tariff?
I don't know. I mean, if you look at, there may be something to that, but I think that the most fundamental difference is always, up here. It's
Yes.
It's the way people think about the problems that we have. I think institutions can be flexed to do a wide range of different things when the will is there. The challenge in the U.S. is that the will has been fragmentary when it is present, and has often been short-lived. The retirement of the PTC and now the looming ITC in 2016. A lot of the federal level policies have been on and off, and that definitely impacts the market from the local level all the way up to the federal level. And I think that in the U.S., it does seem to me, now this is kind of a non-academic observation, but it does seem to me that the power of established interests and influence is much stronger than in markets like even here in Europe. And in Australia. Now, the utilities in Australia are quite powerful, but when the regulatory agency calls the shots and the regulatory agency has the power to regulate, they have taken a more, not always, but broadly a more progressive approach to allowing solar on the network. Many utilities, many PUCs across the United States, the Public Utilities Commissions, remain very much in an old sort of traditional paradigm, an older traditional paradigm of the electricity system and the way electricity systems work, with high voltage transmission lines, centralized power plants serving load to largely captive customers. Now we've seen some move towards customer choice. This is a big rally in the U.S. to improve choice and availability of options. That may partly solve this just by the introduction of new business models, but it seems to me that in large parts of the U.S., if you look at the central states like Wyoming, the Dakotas, even across the Midwest, like Arkansas, I mean, a lot of those states are still in very traditional, regulated kind of environments that remain broadly hostile to anything other than coal.
Yes, it has.
To put it.
Yes,
not to put too fine a point on it, but I think that would is broadly what remains the case. So that's partly why I'm quite encouraged by this sort of prosumer potential, because it is from the bottom up and it is driven by what people want. It's not driven by regulatory mandate or by federal laws. It's really driven by a choice and an investment that individuals make. And I think in a lot of coal-heavy states across the United States, particularly in sunny states like New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, Texas, you could see some pretty significant uptake of just non-incentivized solar on the network, even without a feed-in tariff in the years ahead. And obviously that will be contingent on PV continuing to decline in cost. But in many markets, I think we're pretty much there. So we're very much on a tipping point.
So they need to educate the public about the cost, what the actual cost is right now and in the future. That's probably very critical. And that's what we're here.
Yeah, and that's part of it. To answer that question a little bit more directly about cost, I think that, we've had, obviously, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but many of the existing sources on the network are highly subsidized, either directly or indirectly, either through externalities like water and air and soil pollution, lost agricultural output, coal pollution, subsidizing coal ash depositories, and all of the different sort of levels and layers of subsidies that we give to the conventional industry, I think makes it hard to have an apples-to-apples comparison on costs. And renewables have always suffered from that. I'm not one to really sort of whine about that. I just think it's a reality that we need to deal with. And renewables have thankfully been able to sort of demonstrate their competitiveness in the marketplace, even in spite of those realities. And I think the cost question is increasingly, I don't want to say irrelevant, but kind of beside the point. As I was mentioning, PV is now cheaper than most residential retail rates across the world. Not only here, but even in some of the emerging markets where rates are quite subsidized. Wind, you can generate almost anywhere in the world for under 10 cents per kilowatt hour. It's no longer fair or accurate to characterize renewable energy as more expensive than conventional options. In fact, in many cases, it's cheaper. If you look at Hawaii, diesel costs of generation on Hawaii for fuel alone are over 30 US cents a kilowatt hour. And against that, you can generate PV in Hawaii for unsubsidized for around 13 cents, 14 cents. So we're there. We just need to continue to maintain the momentum and allow the market to shake out. And I think that's going to involve some of the traditional players losing market share, and it's going to involve new technologies gaining market share. And I think that's kind of where we are.
And you were mentioning earlier about net metering versus feed-in tariff. There's been a lot of discussion and debates about that. Can you shed some light as to the differences and pluses and minuses of both, and perhaps would it be possible for them to coexist?
In many markets, they do coexist. Germany introduced a net metering policy briefly for a year and a half. A couple of years ago, there's now discussion of net metering in some of the major European markets like Spain and Italy and France. Ontario in Canada has had a net metering policy coexisting with the feed-in tariff there since 2006. And so they're not mutually exclusive. They definitely can coexist. I think the difference becomes around scalability. One of the things that feed-in tariffs have enabled is they've enabled the market to scale like net metering never could have achieved. Because it standardized the contract terms and it enabled anybody to set up essentially a power plant based on renewable energy resources and sell their output fully to the grid. So under that arrangement, your off-taker, the buyer of your power, is not an individual household. It's the sum total of households and businesses and industries. So essentially, you're underwritten by your off-taker is the aggregate of all ratepayers. And that's a much more low-risk bet, low-risk investment to finance than to finance an individual household loan to a PV system for someone to produce their own self-consumed power. So I think net metering has fundamentally been at a disadvantage because of that very fundamental financial reality. And to be honest, I don't think enough has been written about that, or I don't even think many people in the U.S. fully, and including here in Europe, fully understand that
Yes.
difference. With a feed-in tariff, your off-taker is the sum total of ratepayers.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially the credibility of the electricity system itself. Whereas under net metering, it's always linked to the individual household. That tends to favor households, obviously, with better credit ratings, with better, more free cash flow, more disposable income, as we say.
Mm-hmm.
And that has disadvantaged other lower income customers who can't participate. Here in Germany, many low income households still can finance a PV system because they don't need very much money up front. They can get a loan for over 95% of the total capital cost, and they just need a roof and a permit. So I think that's really one of the fundamental differences between the two, and I think that's partly why FITs have been more successful at driving scale. Net metering is sort of a niche within the electricity market that targets a specific subset of customers. It can work for commercial clients, commercial customers, as well as industrial customers, and it can work for a limited subset of residential customers. But it's difficult to see how net metering could fundamentally transform the electricity system, more than, say, 5 or 10% of the mix. Now, Australia has made it to, as I said, about 12% of households, but as a percentage of electricity mix, it's still 2 or 2.5% of the total mix. So we're talking a fairly small part of the market. And I'm not sure that net metering will get us there.
Right.
I guess if we really need to, if the IPCC is right and we need to fundamentally decarbonize the power sector in the decades ahead and transition our electricity systems away from fossil sources, I'm not sure net metering is going to get us there. Net metering may be a part of the puzzle, a part of the solution, but it alone is not going to trigger that fundamental transition.
Yeah, it seems as though, well, intuitively, that it's very much tied in with the cost. And wouldn't you say that as the cost decreases, net metering becomes less effective than feed-in tariff?
As the cost of
The solar, as the cost of solar goes down, then it seems one is more fitting than the others. Well,
yeah,
tariff.
You mean if you're going to set up for your own house, you would just as soon consume it yourself rather than send some to the grid? Is that what you mean?
Yes, well, that's part. Yes, part of it. Because the net metering seems to put a cap, doesn't it? So it's not really fully utilizing the surface area of individual homes, or even Walmart, or if the incentive is only based on net metering, they would only put so much up to the point that they will be consuming, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
also,
and I think that's net
metering.
That's another fundamental characteristic of all net metering policies is that they are heavily capped. They have restrictions often on individual system size and on total program size. So the primary reason for that is that utilities want to prevent revenue erosion. Because if more customers, let's just run a quick simulation. If you have approximately 40% of your kilowatt hours being sold to retail customers, and let's say 10% of those go net metering, then you might lose something like 4% of your total electricity sales. If you lose 4% of your total electricity sales, you've basically lost your most profitable customers, because residential retail customers are often your most profitable customers. So utilities have often resisted that, and they've only acquiesced or assented to net metering programs because of regulatory pressure, in most cases, because of that fear of revenue erosion. So net metering also kind of pits consumers against their utilities in a way that FITs don't, because FITs are fundamentally about production. It's about diversifying the array of producers, not behind the meter revenue erosion. So there's important differences there between the two as well, that have made net metering inherently more capped than feed-in tariffs. Because feed-in tariffs can displace marginal generation on the network, like natural gas, or in some cases hydro, or coal, and in some cases even some of the heavier stuff like nuclear. That's competing on the sort of marketplace. But with net metering, you're really directly hitting the bottom line of the utility by reducing their sales.
Okay.
So and that's one of the reasons they've been more heavily capped and constrained. So I think until that changes, net metering is always likely to be a heavily capped regulatory option or policy option.
So as cost goes down, perhaps we can move from net metering to feed-in tariff. But how was it decided whether or not for them to coexist or to move from one to the other as time goes on? And how smooth of a transition can that be, do you think?
I'm not sure that there's a linear pattern of history here that net metering will eventually give rise to feed-in tariffs. I'm not sure that necessarily will always be the case, even if costs continue to come down. I think that regulatory decisions and politics are always local, so we're likely to see this battle take different, this take different shapes in different areas, even if costs continue to come down. The risk that the traditional model or the traditional paradigm faces is if costs continue to come down, as you pointed out, we reach a point in the future where maybe net metering won't even matter anymore. People are happy to fully disconnect. And this is what the Rocky Mountain Institute just put out a report on grid defection, which would essentially means customers disconnect from the grid altogether and just produce their own power by a battery with a battery storage system. So those things start to become possible if costs continue to come down, and then net metering becomes obsolete. I think that could happen. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking in that respect, when you think feed-in tariff is actually also something very positive for the utility companies to consider, because that essentially gives consumers an incentive to stay on the grid rather than off the grid. So in the long run, that may actually help to stabilize the grid and utility company, if they see it that way.
Yeah, and the utility then becomes an intermediator between the electricity supply, which comes from a wide range of suppliers, and the end-use customer, who still needs that service to be supplied to them in a reliable way through an intermediary. I think that is what some analysts and some writers on this are beginning to suggest, is that that's the future of the utility, is more this intermediary role, similar to how banks intermediate financial services, providing packaged credit to individual homes and individuals. That utilities could become intermediators of electricity, providing customized packages to individual customers. And those could be residential customers, they could be commercial customers, and we could see a multiplication of different packages and offers based on a wide range of different needs. And I think we're moving towards that in some jurisdictions. If you look at highly competitive retail markets with very active retail competition, it's very much taking off here in Germany, some markets in the US, in New England. I think that is likely the end game here, where utilities either, because it's not clear that their traditional niche is going to exist anymore in the future electricity system.
They have
if that
to
future
grow.
niche doesn't exist, it's kind of like the dinosaurs and the mammals. When the asteroid hit, the mammals were a lot quicker were a lot more effective at adapting, and the dinosaurs unfortunately weren't able to adapt as quickly and died from a combination of lack of food and cold.
Yes. So unless they learn to adapt, then they're not going to be able to stay around too long.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the most important messages for utility executives across major markets like the United States, is that the future is to be adaptable.
Especially within, I imagine, 5 years or so, we have probably much better storage capacity. The battery system will be much improved and more efficient and lower cost. That would really change the whole picture.
Yeah, and that's another parallel evolution here that I think we could see interact in a more synergistic way with the electricity system than we've ever seen. The scale in the battery market is not going to be driven by solar systems. The scale in the battery market is going to be driven by automotive sector. And if we continue to see the growth of the battery market in the automotive sector, combined with the growth of laptops and cell phones and all the other batteries using lithium-ion or some variant thereof, we're going to see the electricity sector benefit from a fairly significant cost reduction, or the sort of cost curve downward that's been driven by the economies of scale and the research and innovation and R&D in the battery space that's happening largely because of the automotive sector, that the electricity industry will get a free, will benefit from as sort of a freebie, something that it hasn't had to contribute tremendously to the R&D for, but companies like Tesla and others help bring that cost down and make it available not only to automotive buyers but also to residential households. So I think we're likely to see a fairly powerful synergy there between the cost reductions in the automotive sector and the electricity sector, and that could be another game changer that makes all of this accelerate. What we're looking at is sort of a series of factors that are serving to accelerate the transition towards renewable energy in a range of different areas, including technological drivers. And we're seeing a conflicted sort of mess of regulatory and policy measures that are in some cases encouraging, in some cases holding back. So the technological drivers are all in the forward-moving direction. They're all building positive momentum. We're going to have all these synergies. Smart grids are going to make it easier to use demand response to balance supply and demand in real time. We're seeing a host of new technologies emerging, as you mentioned, batteries, smart interfaces, so that you can see real-time power demand and monitor your demand accordingly, or adjust your demand accordingly. All of those things are happening in parallel. All the technological drivers are in the right direction. The only ones that are occasionally in the sort of that are serving to resist that are policy and regulatory, primarily. So I think once in the areas, in the jurisdictions where the policy and regulatory factors are also geared up, then that's where the magic happens. That's where you really see the transformational change happening. And I think that's, over the last 12 years, 13 years, that's what's been happening here in Germany, is that both the technological drivers and the policy drivers have been sort of working in harmony, or in lockstep together to fuel that. Now we're seeing a bit of a change. Some shifts in the policy discussion, but in the markets where those drivers are both working in the same direction, I think that's where we're going to see the real transformational change.
And that probably requires some level of grassroots, as you have mentioned, on the local level.
Yeah, and I think, you see in many markets here in Europe that citizen opposition, even in the U.S., and citizen opposition to wind farms is a huge factor.
Oh, yes.
Opposition to large solar farms in areas where there's not much else going on, like Nevada or deserts in Eastern California. I don't want to belittle obviously turtle habitat and lizard habitat is really important, but we're seeing surprisingly heated battles over those kinds of projects that suggest that maybe the bigger is better approach is not always the fastest way to get the job done. We may find that it's more effective to have a more decentralized approach. Relying less on 300 megawatt solar farms and more on sustained deployment of distributed systems. And I think that is another really fundamental difference it seems to me, between much of what's happening in the U.S. market and much of the philosophy underpinning utility and regulatory decision making in the U.S. and the philosophy underpinning a lot of what's happening in the European context. Is in the U.S. it's often predominantly focused on large centralized systems and solutions rather than decentralized systems and solutions. And I think the key to maintaining public support is for people to feel like they can participate, they can contribute in some way, they can invest on their own, they can, so that it's consumer driven rather than top down. I think if you look at every other revolution in retail, whether it's the sort of emergence of the shopping center or the supermarket, those things have been made possible by consumer demand. Yes. It's the decentralized approach rather than, sort of a central planning approach that still underpins a lot of traditional utility and regulatory thinking.
Not to mention, we have seen distributed power is probably going to be able to respond to a lot of natural disaster much more effectively, be it hurricane or tornadoes, or that's just a very natural part of the whole setting.
That's the resilient. It's a very good point on resilience, and I think this is one of the very bright spots I think in the U.S. context currently, is that there is a rising awareness after Katrina and after the winter.
Yes.
You've all had.
Amazing. Yes.
The rising awareness of the importance of resilience, I think, is really is a very positive shift, and I think decentralized systems are quicker at responding to those kinds of resilience-related threats, whether they're climate or triggered by other factors. It's and that's a really important part of this as well.
I have a question about. We understand that Nevada actually has gone through back in 2010 or 2011 or so. They were trying to push through a bill that's called the Fit for Nevada. Have you heard of it? Or
I think I saw something like that, but it hasn't passed into law.
No, it went through, passed the Senate, but didn't get through the Assembly. So I was curious to see what caused the blockage, so we can all learn to see, as you mentioned, all of these resistance to Feedin tariff. A lot of time it's a matter of will or political will, or perhaps it's a lack of knowledge, or I'm not sure which is. But what happened in Nevada? Why did it get stopped?
Yeah, I think I've been a lot of these discussions, especially in the U.S. around feed-in tariffs, as you know, get caught up in sort of ideological debates around, free markets versus government, or versus regulation, or versus, the market setting the price or regulation setting the price. And that often has been a factor that impedes meaningful progress. I've been increasingly, I think the right framing there is more around, is to look at it more from a finance perspective than an economic perspective. You know, finance trumps economics on this point. I think if we can, you know, both conservative politicians and progressive politicians, both, you know, very fiercely ideological people from both ends of the spectrum can appreciate basic financial workings, basic financial principles. And I think when you look at it through a financial lens instead of an economic lens, a lot of these problems start to disappear. They no longer become major roadblocks. Roadblocks either up here or roadblocks in the sort of political decision-making process. What long-term contracts do is they make finance possible, full stop. And if we need more finance to be funneled, to be channeled into renewable energy assets of all kinds, you know, whether it's solar projects, small and large, wind projects, small and large, run-of-river hydro projects, biomass, biogas, you name it, those projects need capital. And if we're going to get to a lower carbon future, we're going to need lots of finance. So this is fundamentally, I think the conversation is more importantly, better understood rather, through looking at it through the lens of finance than looking at it through the lens of economics and what is, you know, what is market-based or not. It's not about what's market-based or not. It's what do we need to make this financeable at the lowest cost possible.
So are you thinking in terms of whether or not there will be investors willing to invest, or if it's cost-effective in the long run, or can you embellish a little bit?
Yeah, so if you, let's take one example. You mentioned Nevada. So let's say we're in southern Nevada and I want to finance a 10 megawatt solar project. That 10 megawatt solar project, forget tax incentives for the moment, in sunny southern Nevada can be generated for somewhere around 10 or 11 cents US, levelized on a 20-year contract. US cents. Now, in that context, if that requires a low cost of capital, that's if you're financing it with, let's say, 80% debt, and your debt is costing you somewhere around 3 to 4%. So your weighted average cost of capital would be maybe around, say, 5 or 6%. If you double that cost of capital, you double the average cost of finance, you increase the cost of that solar project by about 50%. So instead of costing 10 or 11 cents, it's going to cost you 15 to 17 cents. Just because of one single parameter being changed, that single parameter being the cost of capital. So the cost of capital has a tremendous impact on the cost of renewable energy. The cost that ratepayers pay, the cost that utilities pay when they purchase it. So if we want least cost or electricity supply, least cost renewable energy for the system, we really need to focus on how can we reduce the cost of finance. And primary ways of reducing the cost of finance are to reduce the risks.
Yes.
Now, because the more risks there are, the more, the less capital there is available on the one hand, so to your point, and the more expensive that capital is. So those two things go together, because the fewer people are prepared to invest, there tends to be a smaller pool. They know they're a smaller pool and they can ask for more. Whereas if there's a very large pool of investors wanting to support that project, then the cost of capital goes down because there's competition between lenders to support that individual project. So reducing the cost of capital is absolutely fundamental. And I think we've lost that in a lot of the sort of somewhat chaotic and contested regulatory landscape in the United States. Cost of capital is fundamental, and policy should be focused on reducing it. And I think if we could get back to that that basic financial insight, the economics would be less of an issue, and the ideology would be less of an issue, because everybody can understand basic finance.
Yes. I think I've gotten an email within the last couple of days that somebody was commenting that some of the current business models, or the ones who are actually installing the solar, actually will be resistant to the fit. And what do you think about it? I mean,
yeah, I mean, the solar
why-
cities of the world have a certain business model, and when it's perfectly normal for a business model to oppose something that would achieve the same objective without that business model. I think what you're seeing there is fundamentally a clash between those two different ways of approaching the problem, those two different business models. And I think Solar City, there's a lot of good to say about making residential solar possible to a large number of people. But it's also not hard to understand why they would oppose a feed-in tariff, because the feed-in tariff basically cuts out the intermediator, and they're intermediator. So it is a solution that cuts out the middleman, and they are the middleman. So it's obvious that they would oppose that, or it's understandable rather that they would oppose that. Again, I don't come down too hard on either. I think that obviously the fit retains attractive characteristics in that it is available to a wider number of people. The majority of the profit of the revenues goes to the system owner, which is another significant positive dimension. And you have less of the profit going to an intermediary, and that has to be good for efficiency. So if you want, democratic scale up of solar, I don't mean democratic in the political sense, I mean sort of democratized scale up of solar, then something like net metering or FIT is probably preferable to what Solar City is doing, partly because people retain a more direct share of the profits of that investment. So I think it's easy to understand why those new business models are opposing FITs. Again, it's yet another battle that needs to be fought, and it needs to be fought partly in the court of public opinion, but also it needs to be fought, I think, with regulators who make these decisions about whether or not to allow different kinds of business models to operate within their service area.
Actually, do you think there might be sufficient amount of business to go around for everyone to have FIT and to have a business model like Solar City? There's a lot of installation that needs to be done, so potentially there will be sufficient for everyone.
Yeah, I'm more optimistic on that. I think that the more, it's like Darwin had this metaphor in The Origin of Species in one of the later editions of the wedge, that new species enter into the ecosystem of nature by wedging themselves into the existing, sort of like pie chart metaphor. And new species define a niche for themselves by doing that. They have to, either make use of resources or food sources in the environment that no one else is eating or using efficiently, or they have to insert themselves in some other way. Birds build nests, moles dig holes. You carve a niche, and I think the same thing is very much happening in the electricity sector, where there's different niches, and I think you're probably right that there's room for a wide range of different niches, including business models like third-party solar. And again, there are people who are very, very tooth and nail about that fight. I tend to be a little bit more, optimistic. I think there is room for both, and I think we're going to see both continue to deliver solar, make solar possible for people across the country.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you're talking about is how critical up here is, and I have been seeing a lot of false representation or misinformation out there about solar, about Feedin tariff. And for example, Gainesville is one of the first cities that's actually introduced. I mean, this is the one in Florida that's introduced FIT, and but recently they've basically gotten away. They have completely gotten rid of it, and that's been introduced by some opponents as a representation of failure on the part of Feedin tariff. And they also point to Germany, that they've been starting to reduce the FIT. But can you explain to our viewers why this may not necessarily be an indicator of failure on the FIT or Feedin tariff?
I think Gainesville, I actually went to Florida and I visited Gainesville, and I met with Ed Reagan, who was responsible for bringing that program in 2009. And fundamentally, that was driven by Ed. Ed went to Germany, had a chance to visit, to learn about it, and said, hey, we can do that. We can do that in our service area. We have a supportive PUC. Broadly, it's a municipal utility. They control their own decisions. And there was public support for it. So Ed managed to, as a leader in his community, managed to get that implemented in 2009. And it was a fairly modest one by international standards. We had a few megawatts per year installed on the network. It did make it by far and away the leader in solar in Florida, but also in distributed solar, certainly a leader across the United States. And that, I think, on the one hand, is a demonstration or is a testament to what local leadership can do. Ed is a great example of that. But it's also not, it's worth underscoring that Ed recently retired. Mm-hmm. So without that champion who had introduced the policy, there was no one there to fight that fight quite like he did to make it happen. So I haven't spoken to Ed since it was repealed, or since it was discontinued. But I suspect there's a number of factors. Again, all politics is local, but to me, it demonstrates the local leadership, the role that local leadership plays. And when that local leadership retires or moves on, it can be harder to maintain the momentum. So I wouldn't chalk that up as a failure of feed-in tariffs per se, but a shift in the local politics. There have been many policies that have managed to adjust and change over time without leading to their full discontinuation. I work quite closely with many governments around the world on theirs, and you take governments like Malaysia or even China, some of the larger jurisdictions in the world, continuing to adjust and refine their policies despite any of a number of other external or internal factors, because policy can be adjusted and can be improved and can be made stronger. I think in Gainesville, the decision was made, instead of trying to improve it or adjust it, simply to discontinue it. So shifting to the conversation here in Germany, I think that there is it's a very multi-layered conversation. And there's many different, to really understand what's happening in the German market, you need to look at it from a multi-layered perspective. On the one hand, you have citizens who have been largely the ones driving the energy transition, who have been participating in feed-in tariffs either directly by investing in residential systems or together in cooperatives or community groups. Churches across the country have been able to participate and have been able to invest in this. And many of them are now raising their voices in opposition to some of the changes that are taking place at a federal level. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the big utilities and the large industrial customers who have been pushing for more restrictions and more caps on annual levels of development, because Germany has been unique around the world in being the only uncapped feed-in tariff. Uncapped both in terms of project size and uncapped in terms of total capacity installed. And that, some have argued, and I myself among them, that that's at some stage has to change, because on the one hand, it's constrained by the physics of the grid. You can only have so many electrons flowing through particular lines in the network. So there has to be the introduction of a regulatory limit at some point to slow down the rate of development. Now, we're arguably nowhere near that, but there are many communities in Germany that are already producing more than 100% of their total load. So we're beyond that in many reasons, in many areas. So the politics are quite complicated. I think we are seeing changes in the design of the feed-in tariff, moving towards a premium model away from a traditional fixed feed-in tariff. It's to increase the use of locally available sort of in domestic energy supply sources. And that is a core part of all the feed-in tariffs that have followed. It's using locally available resources to harness what energy we can, and to allow that to happen driven by the private sector. The US was also in the process of a decentralization of the electricity industry that PURPA helped usher in by creating a marketplace for independent power producers, as distinct from publicly traded utilities, publicly owned utilities, like government-owned utilities, and a couple of the sort of hybrid entities that existed at the time. There's a number of rural electric cooperatives, etc. PURPA helped introduce a new actor into the landscape, a new player, the independent power producer, who was encouraged to use domestic resources, American resources, to produce energy, in particular electricity, but also combined heat and power systems that produce thermal power. Now, I think something of that got lost along the way. The importance of those two pillars, security of supply and diversifying the mix. This energy independence and the diversity of the mix, somewhere got lost along the way, and the whole show, most of the PURPA show, got dominated by the natural gas explosion of the early 1990s and through the 1990s, where natural gas asserted itself through competition combined with regulation, essentially dominated the market for independent power production. And if you look at the statistics, it's quite staggering. Natural gas just, ate the cake and took everyone's lunch money. And that was partly because natural gas was so cheap throughout the 1990s. And it at the time, solar and wind just weren't quite there. And even bioenergy sources struggled, though they made some headway in states like Maine and in the U.S. Northwest, in Washington and Idaho. So it's important to understand why PURPA failed in order to understand why feed-in tariffs remain a bit of a struggle in the United States today. I think some of the same arguments that were used against PURPA, even in 1978, are still many of the same arguments that we're hearing today against open access electricity policies like FITs that allow people to participate and invest. And I think that's part of somewhere along the way we lost some of those insights that they use local resources, domestically available resources, renewable resources so that they can't be depleted, and they increase our energy independence by reducing our reliance on imports. So all of those different factors are still part of the narrative in the U.S., but they don't seem to dominate regulatory thinking and regulatory decision making. And I think that's, we hear a lot more about carbon today than we do about just concepts of diversifying the mix.
We're facing a more critical time frame also, probably. We really need to shift on moving away from fossil fuels. It's probably the driving force, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, if we're going to get there, if we're going to move toward a system that relies less on that, it needs to be financed. And there are many different ways of financing things. You can have things be government financed, or the government borrows and builds, which is how the Hoover Dam was built. Or you can have things be privately financed at a very basic level. If we choose for it not to be government financed, but rather privately financed, then under that, there's another branch. You can have things be financed by existing utilities who currently own and invest in electrical assets. You can have it invested by by new investors, like Solar City or some of the third-party actors. Or you can have it invested in directly by citizens and communities or even municipalities. Now, I think in the US, the consensus is quite clear that it shouldn't be the government investing in electricity infrastructure or electricity assets. So we're quite clearly on the private side of the equation, as I think most of the world is. But under that, most of the market is still going to the first two, is going to traditional utilities as well as these emerging business models that remain few in number and still very much in a traditional mold, and less driven by communities and citizens. And I think in the future there's a potential for more of that to be driven by individuals and by citizens. The challenge becomes they need an enabling environment in order for that to happen. And as we, thinking back to our discussion around drivers, currently the policy and regulatory factors are kind of holding that back. And that's the battle, I think, that looms in the years ahead. And it's not going away. I think a lot of people think you could sort of suppress this out of existence. Renewable energy is getting cheaper and cheaper, and conventional sources are by and large getting more and more expensive, with the exception in some pockets of natural gas. But by and large, the trend is clear. And I think as that continues, that regulatory debate needs to be had. And I'm confident in the long run, much like Winston Churchill said about the U.S., that at the end of the day, they do the right thing after exhausting all the other options. I think we're probably going to see something similar emerge in the electricity industry, because there is a strong appetite across the U.S. I lived in Colorado, and I traveled widely across many states, probably over half of the United States. And there is a strong appetite for producing your own power, being in control of your own stuff, your own house, your own car, your own. It's a very. I think so. I think that notion of consumer ownership hasn't quite translated into the electricity business, and once it does, I think that's when we're going to really start to see significant change at the local level across the country.
How important do you think transparency will bring to the picture?
Transparency on the
data or regulations, and in terms of the cost of individual or different localities may have different cost issues. And
I think the transparency of decision making, local decision making, is really important. If you look at cities like Fort Collins,
and value of solar. That's what I always was also thinking about. Information, value of solar seems to require that.
Absolutely. No, I think that's to the heart of it, and ultimately, I think in order for local people to understand what is at stake. They need access to the information that goes into these kinds of decisions, and that requires transparency. And I think we have a lot of progress yet to make on transparency, not only in the U.S., but also in Canada and also here in Europe and in other countries. You're absolutely right.
What do you think? How much impact did Feedin tariff have on Germany's economy, for example?
Well,
Or
Germany
renewable
has. I mean, if
energy?
you take a look at the statistics, it's Germany just posted last year its largest trade surplus ever, and it's not only largest surplus Germany has ever posted. Major news terminals, I believe it was Bloomberg, reported that it was the largest trade surplus of any country potentially ever. So Germany the economy is doing very well. Unemployment is among the lowest in the European Union. The manufacturing sector remains strong. I think there has been international media sources have had a very hard time sort of making those two narratives make sense, or rather to make sense of those different narratives. One, a very strong, booming, industrially powerful German economy, and very, very comparatively quite high electricity costs. At the retail, at the industrial level, the difference isn't quite so large, but it's still significantly higher than U.S. industrial rates. But that said, on an average basis, energy is only around 2 to 3% of gross industrial costs. So it is dwarfed by labor costs as a unit factor in the production process. So energy is not the game changer for industrial competitiveness that it often is framed to be. And I think Germany demonstrates that point perhaps more clearly than any other country on the planet. We often hear this narrative, and I've been very familiar with that argument on the Canadian side of the border in regulatory hearings that I've been part of. And large industry is very, very fond of arguing that we need lower, cheaper power to stay competitive. And as competitiveness was not driven by things like a good management team or successful corporate strategy or a customer orientation or an export focus. None of those things matter. It's just energy costs, and I think that's a very lazy and in some sense very entrepreneurial approach to competitiveness. Competitiveness is driven by a range of different things, and energy costs are a comparatively very, very small component of that. And as I mentioned, here in Germany, it's somewhere around 2 to 3% of the total cost factor for industrial facility. So to say that even a 50% increase in energy costs, let's say in electricity costs in this case, would be a game changer is nonsense. And we're not seeing anywhere near a 50% increase.
We are needing to get to 100% renewable energy.
Yeah, and I think the other side of it here is that industries are benefiting from low wholesale prices. So when wind and solar are strong on the network, as they have been in the last couple of days, we had some very windy days and comparatively quite sunny days, wholesale prices crash and they go down, in some cases even into negative pricing. So large industry, including the largest consumers like the rail network, Deutsche Bahn, which is a private rail operator, they can buy on that wholesale market huge volumes of power to run their trains. And they are saving hundreds of millions of dollars a year due to the abundance of renewable energy on the network. So the reason that happens is because renewable energy currently has priority on the network. When it's injected into the network, it receives the priority and the dispatch. That means that if you're the system operator controlling the overall supply mix or dispatching the overall supply system, renewables come in first. And when you have an abundance of wind in the system, for example, it It's traditional supply and demand. There's an abundance of supply, demand is relatively inflexible, and prices crash, prices come down. And we've seen Germany now has the lowest industrial power costs, lowest wholesale power costs of any market in Europe because of renewable energy. So the cost question has been a difficult one to make sense of, but that's a really important part of this, is that retail customers are taking the majority of the burden, and industries are, not only are they shielded from contributing to the renewables surcharge, or what in the US is sometimes called the system benefit charge, they are also shielded, they're in some sense given a favorable treatment because they can buy on the wholesale market. They can gobble up that low cost wholesale power and use it in their processes. So on balance, I think a lot of the criticisms from the industrial sector are more around losing market share in the electricity business than they are around industrial competitiveness. There are a couple sectors that remain more impacted than others. One of them is the steel sector. And steel obviously doesn't only rely on electricity, it also relies on natural gas and coal, often for coking, if you're in the iron business or aluminum smelting. So there are some of those sectors that have a unique cost structure that make them a little bit more exposed to paying that surcharge than other industries. But on balance, I think if you take a look at the German economy and you take a look at the impacts on competitiveness, on job creation, on a host of other metrics that matter economically and that matter for politicians, Germany's doing fine. And in fact, is doing better than almost any other country that one could compare it to. So I think the idea, the narrative that the energy transition or the feed-in tariff has derailed, or risks derailing the German industrial powerhouse is hyperbole at best and disingenuous at worst.
So you can honestly say that feed-in tariff will actually stimulate also a lot of local economy and local jobs, and not to mention the fact that it is going to be much more responsible in terms of dealing with national security or energy security, and the fact that we have to transition into renewable, and so that seems to be a no-brainer, isn't it?
Well, particularly in light of what's happening now in Russia, there's another point that hasn't been fully appreciated, I think, by the media, is that there is no single factor that has contributed more to reducing Germany's reliance on natural gas than renewable energy. Gas has the average number of full load hours that the gas plants in Germany operate has gone down from somewhere around 3,500 to 4,000 hours per year to somewhere around 1,500 hours per year. So that means they're running, instead of running about 45% of the time on average to 50% of the time, they're operating instead more in the sort of 15 to 20% of the time. And that's why many of the new gas plants are being mothballed and are being rebuilt in places like Turkey and Brazil. So Germany, the renewable energy development here has probably done more to reduce reliance on gas, on Russian gas in particular, than anything else that Germany has done. And I think that's an important component of this, because gas gets displaced first in the network. Renewable energy competes first and foremost against gas plants, and that would be the case in any electricity market, regardless of location. There are a few exceptions where it would be, maybe where there just isn't gas in the network because there's not a gas network. But by and large, gas is what renewables displace first. So any effort to boost renewables reduces your reliance on gas.
And definitely we here, especially in Florida, have far more sunshine than you do in Germany. So definitely we can take advantage of it. But okay, finally I want to ask you, is there anything you would like to tell our viewers and general public about feed-in tariff or about anything under the sun?
I think I'd like to see the discussion evolve more toward an appreciation of what we need to face the challenge that's ahead. And I think a core part of that is finance. I look at it, I think, when you take a step back and you look at what drove the Industrial Revolution in the first place. On the one hand, it was technological change, yes. Innovation, the steam engine. But on the other hand, another core part of the Industrial Revolution was also driven by new ways of financing things. After the Napoleonic Wars, there was a blossoming of new vehicles to finance things. Publicly traded companies emerged. You could issue stock, and you could make individual decisions on what to finance, whether it was railroads, cotton mills, ports, canals, roads, you name it. Everything under the sun could be financed in an open way on the marketplace to drive industrial development. That was, in some sense, one could argue, is kind of the unsung hero of the Industrial Revolution is finance. It wasn't just technology. It was fundamentally a mode of finance that enabled a wide variety of different individual projects and assets to achieve or to obtain reasonably priced capital to fuel progress, to fuel development. And I think one of the major challenges holding renewable energy back is often a constrained financing environment. And until we can solve that financial problem and increase the availability of capital on the one hand and reduce its cost on the other, we're going to be struggling to really get meaningful traction on a global level as well as on a local level to get where we need to go. So I'm increasingly inclined to argue that we really need, on the one hand, a bit more financial literacy among our decision makers and more appreciation of how important maintaining the flow of capital is to solar projects and wind projects in the renewable energy sector. And in the renewable energy sector, a key component of that is maintaining the regulatory or policy conditions that allow finance to take place in the first place. There are states in the US that have virtually no distributed renewable energy development happening. That's not because the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. It's because there's an absence or a desert of meaningful policy regulatory frameworks. And if you can couple those two things together, I think, again, the technological drivers are in our favor. The cost factors are increasingly in our favor. The challenge really becomes how to create the policy environments that allow finance to take place, that allow an abundance of decentralized investment to take place. And I think that's really the perhaps the most important component of all of this, and also one of the really important lessons of how things have happened here in Germany, is that the conditions enable finance to enter at various different points in the chain, both all the way down to residential, to local churches and community groups, up to the municipality, in at the utility level, and at the IPP level, and then onward. And I think once you create that kind of an environment, it's amazing what you can do in a short period of time.
I think, well, thank you very much. And I think Feedin tariff seems to be fitting in very well into this picture, doesn't it?
And that's part of the regulatory conditions. I think I'm not as attached to the word. I think we can, if you can call it whatever you like. I think the important thing is what they do. And what they do is they allow citizens and individuals and businesses to participate in producing power in a fair way and transparent way in the electricity network. And that's a very simple but a very fundamental concept. So I'm less concerned about the particular, I work a lot on the different policy design elements and how to structure them and how to finance them. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you call it. The important thing is getting the regulatory design in such a way that it's open, that it allows participation, it allows people to invest, and it creates long-term certainty or long-term stability for that investment to take place. And I think there are markets that have succeeded without doing some of those things, but there are no markets that have succeeded without doing any of them. And I think we really that's the key, is keeping those conditions in place that allow the finance to flow. And I think that's the only way, if we're going to get to a wholly decarbonized power sector by 2050. It's going to take all hands on deck.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the best ways to do that, if not the best way so far, has been an open access policy like the Feedin tariff.
Thank you very much.